The Book of Esther, English Standard Version, Women's Study Bible. Introduction. Author, date, and recipients. Like many Old Testament books, Esther is an anonymous work. It is possible that the author was someone like Mordecai, who had access to historical documents, chapter 2, verse 23, chapter 6, verse 1, and an interest in Jewish affairs. Esther belongs to the period after the Babylonian exile, when Persia had replaced Babylon as the ruling power. The story is set in Susa, one of the Persian capitals, during the reign of King Ahasuerus, better known by his Greek name, Xerxes I, 486 through 464 BC. Some Jews had returned to Jerusalem, where they enjoyed a reasonable amount of control over their own affairs. Others, like Esther and Mordecai, were still in exile. As a minority group, the Jews were viewed with suspicion and sometimes faced threats to their existence. Overview and purpose. The Book of Esther tells how a Jewish girl became the queen of Persia and saved her people from a plot to destroy them. She is assisted in this by Mordecai, her cousin and guardian. Esther was written to explain the origin of the Feast of Purim and to ensure that it would be observed by all future generations of the Jewish people. Chapter 9, verse 28. It has clearly achieved this purpose, since the Jews have continued to observe Purim to the present day. The Book of Esther is read as part of the celebration of Purim. Esther is part of a much larger story that runs all the way from Abraham to Christ and, through him, to the Church. If Haman had succeeded, the Jewish people as a whole would have been destroyed, and the story of God's saving work in them through Abraham's descendants would have come to an end. There would have been no fulfillment in Christ, and therefore no gospel and no Christian church. Christians should read the Book of Esther not just as a story about the Jews, but as part of their own heritage. Christians are not obliged to observe the Feast of Purim, but they are to take to heart the truth that God providentially watches over his own. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Key themes. Esther is an entertaining historical story that also reveals important truths about how and why the Jews survived such an overwhelming threat. 1. Divine Providence. God is not mentioned by name in the Book of Esther, but it shows clearly that, even when God is most hidden, he is still working to protect his chosen people. 2. Human responsibility. Esther and Mordecai show great initiative and courage. Their actions are obviously significant. The providence of God does not negate the responsibility of people to act with courage and resolve when circumstances require it. 3. The absurdity of wickedness. Ahasuerus and Haman were important people who had considerable power, but the story of Esther often causes laughter at their expense. The proud people of this world are not nearly as powerful as they think they are. When they oppose God's people, they bring about their own destruction. God laughs at such people. Psalm 2, verse 4. The story of Esther invites us to laugh with him. Outline. 1. Introduction. Chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 23. 2. Main action. Chapter 3, verse 1 through chapter 9, verse 19. 3. Conclusion. Chapter 9, verse 20 through chapter 10, verse 3. The Persian Empire at the time of Esther, circa 479 BC. Long before Esther's time, the people of Israel and Judah, later called Jews, had been dispersed throughout the Near East by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Eventually, the Persians absorbed nearly all of these lands into their empire, which reached its greatest extent during the time of Esther. Thus, Haman's plot to exterminate all Jews throughout the Persian Empire would have annihilated virtually all of the Jewish people, and Esther's daring actions saved the whole nation from complete destruction. Commentaries. For such a time as this. Esther chapter 2. The book of Esther shows us two things about the Lord, something important and something even more important. The important thing is that although the Lord is great beyond our comprehension, he is also present and involved in the tiniest details of our lives. The Lord used the wounded pride of Ahasuerus to remove Vashti and to clear the way for Esther to be crowned. He used the king's vanity to approve the gathering of virgins for the king. He made Esther stunningly beautiful. He gave her favor with Haggai the eunuch. He had Mordecai in exactly the right place at the right time to become aware of the assassination plot against Ahasuerus. His orchestration of events will become even clearer as the book goes along. God is present even when we don't notice him. God is never once mentioned in the book of Esther, yet he was clearly present and involved. This is still true, even when we don't like the way he is arranging things. It is sad that Esther was an orphan, yet perhaps it was essential that she live with Mordecai at that particular time. God is in each detail. The even more important thing about the Lord is that he has a plan, and he will bring it to pass. He planned from the beginning that Abraham's family would be a blessing to all nations, ultimately in Jesus, who would save mankind from sin and death. If Haman had succeeded in exterminating the Jews, there would have been no Jesus and no salvation. But the Lord would not let that happen. From the vast scope of eternity, the Lord knew what Haman would attempt, and long before Haman hatched his plot, God began to arrange for Esther to be in the right place for such a time as this. Esther chapter 4, verse 14. Nothing, not even the emperor of the known world, could stand in the way of God's plans. What a blessing to belong to such a God! Our responsibility is to do what he calls us to do, whenever and wherever he places us. Esther and Mordecai did the right thing in reporting the assassination plot. In chapter 4, Esther will risk her life to speak up for the Jews. Esther was a nobody. It's hard for us in modern society to grasp that, even after she became queen, she, as a woman, had no power in the Persian society. She was no more than the king's plaything. Yet the Lord used her to save the entire Jewish people. The Lord is present with his people, always, and he will move history to its glorious conclusion in Christ. Trust, worship, and serve our great, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent God. Elizabeth W. D. Groves. Accepting your assignment. Esther, chapter 4. The book of Esther is a fascinating story that involves power, sexuality, corruption, competition, racial tension, jealousy, resentments, conspiracy, and political scheming. The plot has plenty of intriguing twists and turns, the likes of which would rival any Hollywood movie. In a nutshell, Mordecai the Jew refuses to pay homage to Haman, an arrogant man who clawed his way up the pecking order to become the king's top official. Incensed that Mordecai refuses to bow down and worship him, Haman hatches a crafty political scheme to exterminate the Jews. Haman doesn't know that the king's stunningly beautiful new wife, Esther, who was recently appointed winner of the royal pageant, is secretly a Jew. Not only that, she's Mordecai's cousin. Mordecai instructs Esther to appeal to the king. Initially, she's reluctant. Her predecessor, Queen Vashti, was banished when she didn't follow protocol. But Mordecai convinces Esther that God has put her in the palace for such a time as this. Esther chapter 4, verse 14. Winning the royal pageant was no accident. God wanted to use the king's penchant for beautiful women to fulfill a greater purpose, both for Esther and for the Jews. Mordecai challenges her to step up and accept her assignment. She agrees and intervenes on behalf of her people, knowing that it might cost her position and perhaps even her life. Verse 16. God uses all sorts of people and circumstances to accomplish His purposes. Esther was an orphan who lived with the Jewish exiles in Persia with her cousin Mordecai, a minor government official. We don't know why she entered the king's pageant. Perhaps it was to guarantee food and shelter for the rest of her life. In any case, Esther became one of a long line of women who slept with the king and managed to enamor him with her beauty and sensuality. This is obviously not God's ideal for marriage. Even so, He used the situation to bring about good. He used the orphan girl. He used the beauty pageant. He used the playboy king. God's purposes touch the lives of rich and poor, rulers and commoners, the godly and the wicked. There's nothing in this world outside the influence and sovereign purpose of God. We also learn that each of us has an assignment. Esther's assignment of petitioning the king was risky and frightening. The outcome was uncertain. Mordecai emphasized that God would accomplish his purpose even if she refused to cooperate. But if God got someone else to do the job, she would lose the blessing, joy, and reward of faithful obedience. God provided Esther the strength and wisdom to do what he asked her to do, and the outcome was beyond what she could have imagined. Her story challenges us to look beyond our circumstances, limitations, and fears, and ask the Lord, "What is your assignment for me?" Mary A. Cassian. Tragedies transformed into victories. Esther chapter 6, verse 1 through chapter 7, verse 10. God is the ultimate hero in the great drama of redemption. While we celebrate Esther's courage and shrewdness in these chapters, ultimately it was God who outmaneuvered wicked Haman and saved the day for his people. His providence brought the king's sleepless night, the king's investigation of the book of memorable deeds, and the king's desire for counsel at the very moment Haman lurked within his court. The timing and dramatic irony confirm God's authority over human history. Though God's name is nowhere to be found in this book, everywhere God's utter sovereignty prevails. Heroes overcome enemies. Throughout the scriptures, God's enemies who set themselves against him and against his chosen servants ultimately fail. They may rage for an allotted period of time, but God will bring his full justice upon them and vindicate his people. Psalm chapter 2, verses 1 through 2. The serpent bruised the heel of the woman's offspring, but God's own son, born of a woman, bruised the serpent's head. Genesis chapter 3. Balak schemed wickedness against God's people in the wilderness, but God transformed his curse into blessing. Numbers chapter 22 through 24. Nebuchadnezzar demanded that God's people worship his golden image, but God shielded his covenant keepers in the midst of a fiery furnace. Daniel chapter 3. Herod killed and imprisoned apostles to oppress the church, but God multiplied his gospel through their suffering and struck Herod with worms. Acts chapter 12. Above all, God's victory at Calvary showcased his supreme wisdom to outflank his enemies. As Paul wrote to the Colossians, "And you, who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses, by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him." Colossians chapter 2, verses 13 through 15. Like the 75-foot wooden gallows Haman had built outside his home to destroy and shame Mordecai, the tree upon which Satan intended to destroy and shame Jesus Christ became the very place where Jesus openly triumphed over him. God turns the ultimate evils into the ultimate redemptions. The triumph of the cross and the empty tomb stripped God's enemies naked and exposed their ultimate impotence before him. Though they will continue to rage until that day when Jesus uses them as his footstool, he has dealt their decisive death blow. All glory and honor to our King. Does your life story ever feel like a tragedy? Do you ever wonder about the outcome? Christian sister, God has redeemed you from the hands of the bitterest enemies and reversed your fortunes into Christ. In the midst of your momentary sufferings, remember his sovereign rule and rest confidently in your hero's commitment to transform your tragedies into his grand triumph. Mary Wilson.